Welcome to Dr Joe Unplugged. This podcast contains general information and is not in any way medical advice. All right, so today it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Ron Manners, who I'm pleased to say is a good friend. I think I've known you for about 10 years or so,
Sure,
Ron, and been very privileged to come and do some talks at times for the Mancandle Scholars, and I'm a great admirer of what you do to help young people, because younger people are the future. They always have been, but I think they get ignored, and never more so than perhaps in the early part of this decade. So thank you for coming in and talking on the show today, Ron. And first up, because there wouldn't be many, but there might be a few people listening who aren't familiar with you. Can you tell me a little bit about just your own background?
Thanks for inviting me here, Joe, and join you and your listeners. I came from pretty humble beginnings in Kalgoorlie. My grandfather was one of the first mining engineers ever to come there in 1895, and he established a mining consultancy building treatment plants and gold mines at that time. And then the company's still going. I'm still running the company. It's coming on to next year. It'll be having its 130th anniversary, so I think that's probably an occasion for a few drinks. And this was then run by my father. I've taken it over, and but it's been a complete. It's been a wonderful adventure, really, being in business. My experience is only since 1955.
Only
being involved in the business, but the transformation of the business technologically, and the products and the challenges that we've been faced have probably caused me to burst into print and produce a few books on the changes. And it's just interesting having that long historic perspective, looking back, and more recently we've had the global financial crisis, and then the market collapse in 1987, and a few things like that, and they pale in total insignificance compared with what I regard as the biggest business challenge that I ever had in that whole long line of being in business. That was when we were just about put out of business by the Menzies credit squeeze of 1961.
Okay.
It was a remarkable event, and there were huge chains of department stores right around Australia called Reed Murray and Cox Brothers. They had branches in every city in Australia, but due to the Menzies credit squeeze, they all closed. All the finance companies withdrew all their financing from any regional areas, and they could handle the limited amount of hire purchase reserves they had. They could handle that just from head office in the main street of the CBDs of the various cities. So all those businesses closed down, and I remember it was caused by something really weird. The treasurer told Bob Menzies, who was the long-term Prime Minister, that the economy was overheating. He responded by saying, well, what will we do about that? And they said, well, we've got to restrict credit. So they issued an edict, pretty much an oversimplification, saying that they issued an instruction to all the banks that they should restrict their overdraft limit to all business by 50%, and they gave them a week to reduce the overdrafts to every company, firm or family business in Australia just in 1 week. Well,
I've got a $100,000 overdraft, and by the end of the week, and maybe it's drawn out to 80, at the end of the week, I've had it halved, just across the board. Nothing to do with me.
What about that?
Okay.
And I remember my father was living at home, of course, back in those days, and he responded and he said, "Ron, this is very serious." He said, "The minute we get to the office, we'll just set out and round up. We'll go around and visit every client of ours and collect what they owe," because it was quite normal. Although trading was on a 30-day basis, it was quite normal for people to pay within 60 days. Sometimes it dragged out to 90 days, but you knew that you were being paid, so there was no panic. Interest rates were relatively low, so it was not a crisis. But so we spent the rest of that week going from door to door to every client we had and every consultant, and just saying, "Well, we noticed that you're 10 days overdue. Do you mind if we just wait while you write out a cheque so we can walk away with payment?"
Yeah.
And at that end of the week, we had recovered all the money that was owed to us, and we were able to pay our creditors in time. We didn't miss a beat, but only because we took that immediate action and not waiting to read what the newspapers might have interpreted the situation. Dad saw it very clearly and acted quickly, and I've always thought of that burnt an indelible impression on my mind of how we got through that. But the nature of the business changed completely through the lack of finance. People, if they wanted some furniture, they had to pay cash for it, and it was that stimulated a dreadful state of the economy that lasted for many years. So that's it's not reported on, but some of my older friends can recall exactly the events that occurred in their lives at that particular time. The other crashes, booms and busts that we've had with regular, we just developed minor scars from those.
I suppose that 61 maybe doesn't get you don't hear as much about it because this was confined to Australia as against, say, 87, which was
very much an Australian-only event.
And 2008, these were global events. This was an Australian-only event. And I suppose eventually they start, and obviously you remember it, but, comes a time that, more and more people it gets out of living memory, and people who are in business today probably weren't in business, with exceptions. You are, obviously, but there's probably a lot of people who are in business in 1961 who aren't necessarily in business today for a whole variety of reasons. But look, it's also that learning from history, and one learns more from hard. It's not pleasant necessarily, but one learns more from hard times than from good times. But like in sports, I think people learn more from. And I'm not a great sportsman, right? People learn more from losing than they do from winning, because you can take those lessons forward. Yeah. And I suppose as part of that leads into, you've got a new book coming out, and it's your 8th book, Ron, is that correct? Your 8th book?
Absolutely, yeah.
The Impatient Libertarian?
This is more of a book that was written by invitation rather than me just gathering a few thoughts. Can I just mention the origins?
Yeah, absolutely.
Of the book? I was asked to give a talk at a very prestigious economic annual conference called the Mont Pelerin Society, and they move around every year. They have the conference in a different country, and this is about 4 years ago. 3 years ago, I think it was in Guatemala. So I gave this talk. They said, "We want you to," and there were many people from think tanks, the economic think tanks all around the world there, and I was asked to explain why our Mancal Economic Education Foundation was a little bit different to any of the other think tanks that had different characteristics. And they said, just you tell us where the concept came from and why it's a little bit different. I'd never thought of that. It's interesting. Often you are asked to give a few words on something that you hadn't thought too much about. So I thought, well, ours is probably different because most think tanks are based on the or maybe economic theories of one person or the inspiration of one person that guided someone to start a think tank to develop those ideas and concepts. But ours was really influenced by 5 separate individuals in different parts of the world that I'd come in contact during my life, and they'd left an indelible impression on me. And I'd combined those 5 influences together into forming the Mankel Foundation. So they found that talk of great interest, and one of the academic listeners wrote me a letter later, and they said, that was pretty good, but you didn't give us enough. So can you develop those thoughts into a paper and produce it, because we would like to go further into those 5 quite separate individuals, and you pointed out to us that each of those individuals were quite different in their style and their manner and their strategy and the way they went about their affairs. And each were completely successful and quite heroic in what they'd achieved, but they were all different. We would like you to go further and explain what that is, and which is part of the book. So when I analysed them, 5 different people, and I found that in analysing them, I came up with a pie chart, apportioning each one's the way they allocated their time or attention or effort, and I split it between the ideas or philosophy or economics, the theory side of it, and the strategy of what they were going to do about it. And each of those 5 people had a quite different pie chart. The first one was a fellow called Leonard Reed, who started the Foundation for Economic Education in America. And he was 50% ideas and 50% strategy, which is, to me, sounded pretty sensible. Then the next person that influenced me was my philosophy professor. He was based in California, but his pie chart came out just 100% ideas, no strategy whatsoever. His whole ambition was just simply to be the best philosophy teacher in the world, end of subject, don't go any further, and that's it.
Yeah. And that's fine, because some people come up with ideas and other people can implement them. Yeah. In sports, it's inherent that there's a team and not everybody does the same thing, but sometimes in business...
It's very important to realise
that doesn't translate.
Why people evolved into that different style. The third one was Friedrich Hayek, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, and I got to know him pretty well. He was, I think, 75% ideas, and he just was a breathtaking a strategist on flat management and spontaneous human action, achieving so much if just leave it alone. But he was 25% strategy, because he realised that academics left to themselves don't really achieve anything, as he used to put it to me. He said, we might manufacture the bullets, but it's people like you that fire the bullets. So he spent 25% of his time identifying people like me and I, as I said, giving us a job.
Yeah.
So, and then Prince Philip was the fourth one, and he was completely the opposite to Hospice, in that he was 100% strategy. No philosophy, no economics whatsoever. And he, in his instructions, when I was fortunate enough 5 times to be involved with him personally on the Duke of Edinburgh Study Conference, he taught us how to ask questions, and which made me laugh later, or made him laugh later, when I started asking him questions about why can't I find out what your economic and philosophy beliefs are. And I had to ask him 3 times before he laughed.
Yeah.
He said, "You're using it against me, this technique of asking questions." And he said his idea when he wanted a bigger role in life than just marching 10 paces behind the Queen.
Yeah.
And he was a smart, very intelligent guy, and he evolved. He said he looked at the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth, and he said they've got very bright people in government, bright people in industry, bright people in the unions. However, neither of those 3 groups talk to each other. In fact, they hate each other.
Yeah.
He said, "What am I going to do to bring them together so they can work together in unison?"
Yeah.
And his concept was to run this study conference every 4 years, and he gathered 100 of each of those categories.
Okay.
And he locked us together for 3 weeks, and we ate together, travelled together, breathed together. We went around the countryside asking questions together. He broke us into little groups of 3 of each. He gave each group of 9 a full-time secretary. Donated by leading industry companies around the world to travel with us and do the documentation all night so we were fresh to take on the challenge of asking communities and business people the questions of the next day. We weren't caught up in overwhelming of just what happened. So the full-time secretary was vital. And he said to me, and it worked. And I've got so many examples I can prove how effective it works. People who are normally their experience with the Duke of Edinburgh Study Conference were at war with the other 2/3 of their economies. They just came together. They had the ability to pick up a phone at midnight and ring the other guy and sort things out. And he said the minute he exposed what his real belief system was, he would lose 2/3 of what he called his constituents.
Okay, yeah.
And I could just see the brilliance of that 100% strategy, and it worked for him. The 5th one was Sir Anthony Fisher, who was a great disciple of Hayek, and he started the whole IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs in London, and a whole string of think tanks that have evolved into the Atlas Network, who now coordinate and assist over 580 think tanks all around the world in professionalising their effort in training youth leaders. And so he was 75% strategy, only 25% ideas, because the ideas were all in place already.
Yeah.
So that was the real book. The book's about analysing that, and I've been amazed at the feedback I've got from people who've bought and read the book, who've written to me and say, hey, they never thought about modifying their own style or their own proportions of where they're putting their efforts. And since reading the book, they've just varied their own little pie chart, just a little bit this way or that way, and it's made all the difference. How satisfying to an author to have feedback like that.
That's brilliant. I mean, that says A, that people are reading it, and B, that they're taking something from it. And 1,000 people can read it and take 1,000 slightly different slants. Yeah. But I really like what you said then, that they're saying, look, I'm just moving my dial a little bit because... Again, I like sporting analogies. People can relate to them. If you've got a cricket team, you can't have everybody's a fast bowler. You've got to have some batsmen. Maybe you might go on to the batsmen and say, look, why don't you work a little bit on your bowling? You might help out occasionally, but that's not mainly what you do. You're mainly doing the batting. And in these areas, people are going to have their strengths. And I think, having listened to different speakers over the years about archetypes and psychological profiles, that people do have their strengths and you can play to them, and that's really good, and that's where you spend most of your time. But you also need to be able to do some other aspects as well, which is really what you've outlined there, Ron. And what I really... Are you happy to talk a little bit about President Zelensky zooming into your offices in 2022? Or am I sort of... I don't want to go down the path of Ukraine. That's really outside the bounds of what we talk about. But how did that connection come around?
That was a surprise. We every 4 years or every time there's a state election, our Mankell Foundation produces a little booklet. We call it the Project Western Australia, and it's an outline of free market type reforms covering everything from transport to education to shipping to energy supplies, every aspect, and we published this as a booklet, and we get it into the hands of every state politicians of every house, every side, immediately after there's an election, in the hope that some of these ideas may be picked up, because I know once you're elected as a politician, you're really too busy to think creatively about what you really should be doing. So it's to help them. And I must say we've been terribly disappointed at the fact that very few of these ideas have been picked up because they don't see any votes in them. There's some things that really desperately need to be done. I mean, the whole, even just touching on the energy thing, because it's being so badly handled and nobody wants to face the truth, we're just seeing escalating energy prices to the point where nobody is going to manufacture anything, or nobody is going to start any sort of business in Australia in a very few years from now, and we'll wonder why. Yeah. Because we've just been priced completely out of the market by our own stupidity. However, so there we were, disappointed that the ideas were not being picked up locally. Atlas Network, we sent them a copy of our publication, and they said, wow, this is pretty good. So they picked it up, circulated a few copies in Ukraine. I think it's been translated into Ukrainian language to see where there's some application, because they've got a dreadful war. They've been pummeled to death by the vandalism and savagery of Russia, but their thoughts are saying when this is all over, they have a chance to do their economic reforms, which were not done well when all of those former Soviet countries moved out of the Soviet Union. The reforms were not done and not thought through. They were done in a hurry, because in haste. For instance, the property rights was not well handled, so that when they broke away from the Soviet Union, if you were a Ukrainian or a Latvian or Lithuanian and you had an apartment on the fourth floor of a building, you suddenly became the owner of that apartment.
Right.
Pretty good. It was owned by the government. Everything was owned by the government. There were no property rights. So when they privatised, you became the owner of that cubic space in midair.
Okay, yeah.
But they didn't get around to giving you joint ownership of the underlying land, as we know it here in Australia, where you have strata title ownership, mutual ownership of a block of land. So now those buildings were badly built in the Soviet days. And now, 50 years later, they're starting to fall apart.
Yes.
And there's a reluctance to demolish them and start again, because the minute you demolish them, those owners of those little cubic spaces in midair lose everything.
Okay, because they've got no title to the land underneath. They've got no stake in the great lake here. I think to sell a strata block, you have to get 75% or 90% agreement, something like that.
Absolutely, whatever your strata management says. Now, they've in the Ukraine, through these reforms, they've picked up, for instance, they've picked up our Western Australian Mining Act, which was one of the best in the world, and they've translated that, and they're emerging with a replica of our West Australian Mining Act because it's so damn good. Our first Mining Act was not much good, but it was rejigged from about the early 1980s. Then they picked up the Strata Title Act of Western Australia, which we didn't have till the 1960s. We didn't have a Strata Title Act, so they're using those reforms, and they've got a very senior group of Zelensky's team developing these reforms, and they then zoomed into our office for a long seminar session where we had the former registrar of the Mines Department and a whole group of people to guide them through some of these things. So we are delighted with our Project West Australia document now because it's having some take-up, but somewhere else.
So influence spreads. So it spread from from yourself here to Ukraine, and who knows where it may spread to from there. I think that sort of gets back to that concept that the Lord works in mysterious ways, or however one likes to think about it.
We're encouraged.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And look, again, leadership is so important. I don't think we have a lot of it in the world at the moment. In fact, it's very, very little. But 2 points, I think, in your book, where at the start you've got the case for hope and hope for the future, which I think is really important because we see a lot of mental health problems in teenagers. They're all being told the world is going to end, and then you don't really have much hope. It's like, why should I do my homework? The world's going to end. But also, your point here, be an activist, much more fun than being a spectator. And I heard Argentinian President Javier Milei interviewed by Barry Weiss on the Free Press. And for listeners, if you don't listen to the Free Press, I suggest you do. And no, she doesn't pay me to say that. And he said, you're watching a soccer match. He said, the stadium's full.
I thought everybody was watching Barry Weiss on the Free Press because it's absolutely magnificent, isn't it?
And Milei said, because she said to him, you don't like government, you think there should be less government, you've gotten into it. He said, well, if you go to a soccer match, the ball's on the ground in the middle and the stand is full. If there's no players on the ground, there's nothing to watch, there's no game. So rather than being a spectator, he got involved. And I think there's 2 points there in the book. Part 4, get involved. It's better than being a spectator, and hope for the future. Have you got a sort of an overarching concept that sort of pulls the beginning and the end together?
I guess that the basis of... unfortunately, the media is convinced that only bad news sells newspapers or brings eyeballs to screens. I'm not sure. They may be right, but I'm not sure about that because I think we're desperate for some good news.
Well, apparently in New Zealand, their website Stuff has identified that people want better news. They don't want bad news all the time. So, carry on. I think that is exactly right.
And I'm so hopeful for the future. I mean, we never, in the whole history of the world, have we been breathing better air. Or drinking cleaner water, looking at clearer skies. I mean, this is amazing. I mean, as a young person coming down from Kalgoorlie to live with relations in the suburbs of Perth, I nearly choked. In those days, that's the 50s and 60s, everybody in the suburbs in Perth had what they called a chip heater. There was a little heater to heat hot water. There was no solar systems. You didn't.
So these are wood chips they're burning, is it?
Wood chips. They used to put old cardboard cartons, old broken up furniture covered with lead paint and stuff, just to keep the heater going, to keep the
like an old boiler,
water.
Sort of
And the chimneys, they all had, every house had a chimney, belching black smoke for all this burnt up rubbish coming out to create hot water. And walking around the suburbs of Perth was dreadful. I was so happy to get back to Kalgoorlie to get some fresh air. But see, only a memory like that makes me appreciate the clean air. And I look at the clear skies and I say, I just can't believe how anyone can be catastrophizing a situation and saying the end of the earth is nigh. So I'm very hopeful, but hope's a funny thing, and hope. The politicians use the word hope, and that's why the political leadership is not the same as the leadership that I look toward. Politicians peddle hope, but hope is not a strategy.
No. It's the beginning. Strategy, it might get you out of bed in the morning, but
what you're going to do about it.
Yeah.
And that's why it is so much better to be a participant and actually doing something about it instead of complaining or picketing or protesting or something.
Yeah.
Just do something.
Yeah. And again, I think they're not mutually exclusive. If you do have some hope that there is a I don't think there's ever been a better time to be alive. I'm not saying everybody has a nice life, but I don't think in human history there's ever been a better time to be alive. So you have some hope for the future, and that sort of spurs you to say, yeah, I do need to act. I do need to do something. So, Ron, where I'd like to sort of look to sort of move to and probably finish up. Now, obviously you mentioned the 1961 credit crisis and crunch, and you remember wandering around at that time. You're in your ninth decade. You're in excellent shape. I mean, seriously, you're in excellent shape. What are you? And obviously, listeners' podcasts are interested in their health and well-being, and there's no fountain of youth. But what have you done? What have you found that keeps you both physically and mentally in absolutely A1 shape? Do you have any particular regime, or are there certain things that you do, or what works for you?
I find that by regular attending at a gym, or I play soccer with some other suddenly mature gentlemen twice a week.
Right.
we have a great game over at the Leederville Oval, and I go to the gym regularly, and I do exercise. I've always been actually playing squash or playing hockey or playing something like that. I've always felt that that's an essential part of one's balance. It makes you think better, and it clears your head when you're out there on the playing field. You clear your head. You've got to get rid of all the other stuff.
You got to focus on the ball.
Focus on this, and so I think that's terribly important. Then on the mental side, we never. It's only this what they call mental and depression stuff. That sort of sounds as though it's a recent invention, but I think that it's a mindset, and we're all thinking about it. Any one of us that employs people have got to be conscious of mental health and the satisfaction and what they may be being deprived of to create that situation. And I probably thinks back to someone asked me a while back what would be the greatest thing I could ever give to the next generation or my own children. What's the greatest gift that I could leave them with? And after thinking that one through, I came up with the thought that the greatest gift could be self-esteem. And that's something that we don't talk about very much. I'm not talking about giving them an ego or an overemphasis on ego, but it's self-esteem, self-worth, the fact that they have got a challenge in life and they're on their way to achieving something that's greater than they could ever imagine that they would ever achieve. And as you build on those, it's a building process. You build on those layer upon layer of your journey through life, and you take one step at a time and you build that on. It puts you up a little bit higher so you can take a bigger leap forward, and that builds your self-esteem. And that probably leads me to when people have asked, who do I admire, who are my sort of heroes in many ways, and what characterises them. And I think of those 5 people that I wrote about in my book, for instance, they were all different styles, but they all had one thing in common. And I've tried to encapsulate that because we can see examples in life every day of the two different styles. The people that I admire have got what I call humility, but it's a humility that's not to be confused with timidity.
Yeah.
So I call that sort of a heroic humility, in the sense that they've got sufficient self-esteem to understand where they've reached their various goals and plateaus and from which they're going to take off and achieve further things, but they don't have to tell anyone else. Yeah. It's themselves that they're negotiating with and plotting their next move forward, and that's the heroic bit of it. They don't need a lot of feedback. The exact opposite we saw this very week when we saw Julian Assange coming back on a private jet, arriving back in Australia, and off down the gangplank came Kevin Rudd to ensure that he was sharing the TV exposure with this returning person. And I thought to myself, there's Kevin Rudd screaming out, "Look at me!" Yeah. And I think perhaps a symbol of lack of self-esteem. Yeah. That may have driven him to step forward in that way, rather than playing a very secondary role.
I think that's so true.
So I think that the self-esteem is the greatest gift, and that enables one to develop that style of, and I think of it as heroic humility, and I'll do more work to be done on that concept.
Really, it's saying it's a quiet confidence about what you're doing, and not needing to make a big song and dance about it.
You're reporting to yourself.
Yeah. Yes. And, again, and that's in contrast with people who, want to draw attention to themselves, like to exercise power over other people because they love the power, it makes them feel important. Genuine leaders don't need to do that, because leadership means people will choose to go in the direction that you're suggesting. Yeah. That's leadership. Follow, as against corralling people and forcing them to go down a path. And look, I think the other thing, Ron, which I think is really important, when I wrote Do It Yourself Health years ago, one of the pillars of health was fun and purpose, which is having a reason to get out of bed in the morning, something that you feel is important, where you feel there's contribution, and enjoying what you're doing. And, the work that you've done in setting up the foundation to help the next generation. It's probably the second generation of the next generation is already. I mean, at some point, surely there's going to be in due course, some of the children of the early Mancal scholars may well go through the next stage. So that's planting those seeds
every week,
and it's brilliant.
Every week we get feedback from the previous scholars, and there's over 2,200 or at least over 2,000 already. The feedback it's quite interesting. They often say, 5 years ago I had a Mancal scholarship, and it suddenly clicked with me what I learned from that. I was exposed to this set of ideas, and that's helped me into the position I just was appointed to, and it clicked with them that there's a connection. Last night, Jenny, my wife Jenny, and I attended a presentation by Tom White, who's one of our former Mancal scholars, and now he's been pre-selected as a
he's running for
Curtin. Yeah. And he was in joint presentation with John Howard, former Prime Minister John Howard, giving a great presentation, and he was really accounting for himself and his vision should he be elected, and it made us feel so good that we may have just been a little part
That's
of
brilliant.
putting thoughts together. And these man council scholars, many of them have gone back and they have permanent employment with the various overseas think tanks that they went to on scholarships.
Okay.
And then they were invited. They were so impressive to their hosts that they said, when it's all over and you've finished your university degree, please come back and work for us. And they are there. Now, some of them after 4 years or 5 years, they're still there and they're graduating up the success ladder within those organisations.
And in their own quiet, heroic, humble way, making an impact. Ron, where can people get your book?
We've got a website...
which we'll put in put the links down below. But, we might be able to put something on the screen as well. Is there a website for people to go to?
Yes, if they go to the website, which is www, of course, and then the word MannWest, MANNWEST.com.
Okay.
Then click on the button that says Libertarian Bookshop. It takes you straight to the range of books, and there's the Impatient Libertarian. You can choose between a hardcover and a soft cover, whether you want it mailed or whether you want to pick it up. All those options are there. It's easy. And if you'd like me to sign it, put a little note on the saying, please, Ron, please sign and make a comment.
All right. And you're doing a launch in Melbourne in a couple of weeks?
We've done a launch in Brisbane. We're doing a launch in Melbourne on the 10th of July and in Sydney in August. We haven't quite got around to doing anything in Perth, but we will.
Good stuff. Good.
So, anyway, there's more. I'm really enjoying this book, particularly the feedback from readers.
That's fantastic. Ron, thank you so much for your time and sharing your thoughts on the 8th book, and we'll be looking forward to the 9th. Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks for listening to Dr. Joe Unplugged. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, like and share. You can also follow it on all the socials. There'll be new content uploaded each week.